In all those course sections which you went through up to this point, we built a lot of demo projects and example projects. And there's one thing which all these projects have in common. They all basically take place on one single page, with which I mean that their URL never changes. When we navigate around in these apps, when we dive into different features of the apps we built, the URL always stays the same. And this kind of makes sense because you learned that with React, we typically do build a single page application. But on the other hand, you could argue that having a URL which never changes isn't ideal, because after all, it's one of the greatest advantages of websites that you can directly link to a certain page or feature inside of a website. You can directly link to a specific article which is interesting, to a specific product on Amazon.com. That's one of the key benefits of the web in the end. And currently in our React apps which we're building, it's not a feature we can utilize because the URL never changes, and therefore we can only link to the app overall, to the website overall. And whenever we share a link to our website, users can of course visit it, but they will end up on the starting page of our website. And therefore, in this course section, we're going to dive into a concept called routing. And with that, we're going to learn how we can add multiple pages, or the illusion of having multiple pages, with different URLs to the same single page application. So we will still build a single page application where React in the browser is responsible for updating what the user sees, but we will still be able to change the URL and use multiple pages. And if that sounds strange, we're going to learn how it works in this course section. Specifically, we're going to explore what exactly client-side routing is and how we make it work. We're then going to dive into a third-party package called React Router, which we'll use to implement routing in our React application. And we're then going to work with that package to add routing to an example project. And we're not just going to dive into the basics, but as we always did in this course, we are going to dig a bit deeper, and we are going to dive into some advanced features as well: dynamic routes, nested routes, and more. So what exactly is routing then, and why would we want to add it to our React application? Well, I touched on it in the last lecture already. At the moment, all the React apps we built in this course have the disadvantage that they have the same URL no matter where in this app we are. And therefore, if we want to share a URL, a link to a certain feature of one of the websites we're building, we can only share a link to the starting page. And then users have to navigate to a specific feature manually. Now, in reality, you want websites where you have different paths, and those different paths in the URL load different pages, so that when the URL changes, we change the visible content of the page. We load different pages for different paths, and it's then the combination of all those pages with their own paths that make up the overall website. That's how the web works, and that is how our React app should work as well. We have different visual elements, we have different pages, if you want to call it like this, and each page should have its own URL or its own path after our domain. And when that path changes, the visual content of the page should change. Now, when we're not working with React, when we have a traditional multi-page app where we have some server which sends back different HTML files, we would typically build something like this by simply storing different HTML files on the server, or by generating those files dynamically on the server, and then for requests to different URLs, different HTML pages are sent back to the client, and these pages can then be rendered by the browser. Now, this approach works, but it's not the approach we used up to this point in the course. Because when we use different HTML pages, we don't have a single page app. And that means that whenever we change the URL, we leave our running client-side app, we lose all the state there, we have to wait for the request response cycle, and we have to let the browser render this new page. And that's one of the reasons why we switched to React. We don't want to have this traditional flow. Instead, we want to load a client-side application, so a JavaScript web app which runs in the browser, and we want to utilize this application to change what's visible on the screen with JavaScript, so that we can provide this very instant reactive user experience which we can do with JavaScript in the browser. And fetching different HTML pages doesn't fit in there, because there we leave the browser, request a new page, render the new page, and that's not this reactive experience which we typically want to offer. So this approach doesn't work here. We still want to build a single page application instead, and now the good news is that we can do that. We can continue building a single page application, and we therefore only have one HTML page, which is initially loaded when a user first visits our website, and then thereafter we have JavaScript take over. But the good thing is that we can also take a look at the URL and manipulate the URL and that path after our domain with JavaScript. And we can therefore also write or use some client-side, some React code, which controls the URL and which changes what we see on the screen when that URL changes or when a link is clicked, without fetching a new HTML file. So we need some code that works with the URL, that works with that path after the domain, and that listens to clicks on links on our page to update that path in the URL, but which then actually does not send a request to the server for a new HTML file, but instead this code which we write or this package which we add should block this browser default and instead update what's visible on the screen with client-side JavaScript, with React. So we want a package which does all the routing and which looks at the URL and brings different components onto the screen based on URL changes, but which does all of that in the browser. We need to write code that does that, or we use a third-party package that does that. And thankfully, there is a third-party package for that. There is a very popular third-party package called React Router. It is a package which you have to install separately. It's not built into React, but it is a package which then does give us that client-side routing, so that watching and manipulation of the URL and that component rendering based on the URL. React Router is a package that gives us these features that allow us to implement client-side routing. Now you can visit reactrouter.com to dive into the official documentation and examples, or you also visit their GitHub repository to learn more about it, inspect the code if you want to, and of course to also learn how you can get started with React Router. Now I will show you how to get started over the next lectures though, so you therefore don't need to do that on your own. But it is this package which we are going to use. And for this, I did now create a brand new React project. You find this starting project attached. It's an empty React project, just some basic files in there. And it's now this project to which I want to add React Router. And we can do this by running npm install in this built-in terminal in Visual Studio Code, react-router, and now important, -dom. You need this package, not just React Router, but react-router-dom. It's this package which you want to install. And if you hit enter, this package now gets downloaded and gets installed into this project. So now we can use it, and we will now use it, and we will get started with it in the next lectures. Now, with React Router installed, let's get started using it. For this, I'll first of all run npm start to start my React development server in this dummy project. And with that up and running, you should see something like this on the page, this dummy text. And now we want to get started using this React router. But what does that mean, get started using React router? Well, in the end, the goal is that we're able to handle different paths on our page and load different components for the different paths. So that a request for our domain.com/nothing, for example, loads component A, and our domain.com/products loads component B, which could be a component displaying a list of products, for example. That's now the goal. We want to handle these paths after the domain, so this text after the domain, to then load different components onto the screen. And when I say load, I really mean render these components. So it's basically like conditionally rendering a component. You might recall that often in this course we used state to in the end conditionally show a certain component. For example, show some loading text whilst we're in a loading state and show a different component otherwise. Now we in the end want to do the same thing but for different paths in the URL. And we could write our own code for that, where we check what's in the URL and then set our own state, and where we listen to clicks on links and prevent the browser default of sending a request, and instead again change some state to render something else onto the screen. We could do all of that, but we did install that React Router DOM package so that this is done for us. And indeed, React Router DOM makes registering different routes, so different paths in the URL and the components that should be loaded for these paths, very, very easy. And we can get started in this app component here. Here we can import from React-router-DOM. And what I want to import here is the route component. So we import route from React Router DOM, and route will actually be a component. It is a component that allows us to define a certain path and then the React component that should be loaded when that path becomes active in the URL. So for this, we can get started by adding a couple of components. For example, in the components folder. Here we could have our welcome component, the starting page, so to say. Welcome.js holds a component function, just as we learned it, and we of course export this component function so that we can use it outside of this file. And then here, all I'll do is I will render a h1 tag where I say the welcome page. So this is a very simple component which just outputs this JSX code. And now I'll copy that page and create another component, let's say the products component. And in that component file, I'll rename the function to products and I'll say the products page here. So now we got two different components, which are of course very similar, but render different text. And in reality, of course, these components would do more than just output some text. The products component, for example, could fetch and display a list of products, but I just want to get started with routing for now. We will later see a more realistic project as well. But now we got these two components, and I want to load those components as pages with help of this route component. For this, in this app component, we register a route by using that route component like we always use components in JSX. So we just create a custom route element based on this component. And now this component wants a special prop. It wants a path prop, and that should be the path in your URL. And for example, here we could have /welcome. With that, we're saying this route should become active if we have our domain/welcome. Then this route should become active. Now we also need to tell React Router what active means, which component should then be loaded onto the screen. And for this, we actually add opening and closing route tags here. And then between these opening and closing route tags, we can render the component that should eventually be rendered here. For example, here we can import the welcome component from /components welcome, and then just render this here between those route tags. Now, the interesting thing is that this route component will make sure that this welcome component is only displayed on the screen if our URL path is /welcome. Otherwise, this will not be displayed. And of course, we can do the same for the second page we added. We can import products from ./components/products and then add a second route. We just instantiate our route component here, and then, for example, set the path to /products. Totally up to you, of course, whatever path you want to support in your URL. So now we would also support our domain.com/products, and that should then load the products component, whereas the first route will load the welcome component. And to load the products component here, we need to use products between those opening and closing tags. Now that's how we generally do register routes with React Router. And React Router will then make sure that it evaluates the URL and also renders the correct components based on that URL. However, to kind of activate React Router and to make those route components and other React Router features work, we need to do something else in addition to defining those routes. We need to go to our root file here, where we render app into some document element. And here in this root file, we also want to import something from React Router DOM. And that something here is the browser router component, another component provided by React Router DOM. And we simply need to wrap the overall app, so this root app component, with this browser router component. That's all we have to do here, but this will then activate this React Router and unlock these React Router features like defining routes. And if we do all of that, if we go to our page and we enter /welcome here, we see the welcome page. And if we enter /products here, we see the products page. And if I enter anything else like /nothing, I don't see anything. The same for /else. So any other path than the two paths we defined here will not render anything because neither of the two routes becomes active in that case, and hence we simply don't see anything on the screen. And that's in a nutshell how routing works. Now there are more features related to it, and there are more concepts we're going to explore, but that is the core idea behind routing and how we make it work with React Router. Now before we dive deeper, one last word about these two components, welcome and products, which we load for these different routes. These are regular React components, but since we use them as different pages in this application, since we don't use them like all the other components we worked with before, it is quite common that you store them in a folder named pages or screens, whatever you prefer. I'll go with pages. You don't need to name the folder pages. You can stick to components. But having a separate pages folder with the components that are loaded by the router makes it clearer which kind of components these are, and that you do use these components in conjunction with the router. Now you can still have other components in your application which are then not loaded by the router, but which you instead use in other components JSX code, as we did it all the time in the course. And indeed, in reality, most of your components will be regular components. But these special components, And special should be in quotes because these are regular React components. But these regular React components, which are used in this special way, so that we use them as routes, these components can be stored in a separate folder to make it even clearer that here we do have components which we load through the router. And with that, we got basic routing set up. Now let's dig deeper. Now with the basic routing working, we got one clear issue. At the moment, we can only navigate between those pages by changing the URL manually. And whilst we of course sometimes might do that, and whilst we might share a link to a page, it's also pretty common that we want to have links on our page which we can click, which will then take us somewhere else. And therefore, let's now have a look at links and how we would add links to our page. Let's say on our app.js file, we want to have a header above our main section, and it's in this main section where we want to have the routes, and it's this header where we want to have the navigation. And for this, of course, we could also create a separate component in a separate components folder, components and not pages, because this will be a component which is embedded in JSX and not loaded as a route. And in there, we could have our main header component, or whatever you want to call it. So a simple component, regular component function, as we created it multiple times in this course already. And here we then return our header, and in there we could have our navigation with an unordered list with our different links. That is a setup we could have here. Now at the moment we have two routes here, a welcome and a products page, and hence in this first list item we could add a link which leads to /welcome, where we say welcome, and then we duplicate this list item and add a second link to /products, which loads that products page. That is a basic navigation we could add here. Now we can go to app.js and import our main header from ./components/main header, and we just use it here, like this, as a self-closing component. Now we see this navigation here. Now the styling is totally off. We'll work on this in a second, but we can see that we do have these two list items at the top here. So our header is here. And if I click them, indeed we do navigate between those two pages. But this approach has a big flaw. And you can see this flaw if you take a closer look at the top left corner here. Whenever I click these links, you can see that this refresh icon turns to a cross. And that means that we actually load a new page. We send a new request. We can see this even better if we open the developer tools, and in there we go to the network tab. Whenever I click one of these items, you see that new requests are sent. Brand new requests, including a brand new request to a full HTML file. This HTML file here is loaded every time we click on one of these links. So we do send a brand new request to the server serving this app. This works, we get the different pages, but it means that we leave the active single page application. We start a new one when we click one of these links. We lose any application state that we might have in this application. And that is not ideal. That goes against the idea of building a single page application. If we would be managing some cart, some shopping cart for a user, and we would lose all that state whenever we navigate between pages, this would be a suboptimal user experience. So it would be better if this browser default of sending a request and requesting a new HTML page would be prevented. And we could write our own code for that, and we could add click listeners to these anchor tags and prevent the browser default and manually try to get React Router to load the right component, but we don't need to do this manually. Instead, there's another component which we can import from React Router DOM. and that is the link component. The link component does what the name implies. It allows us to create a link. Now we can replace the anchor tag with this link component for both the opening and the closing tag, like this. And we then have to replace the ref attribute, the ref prop here, with the to prop, because this link component wants a to prop, which then holds the actual address we want to navigate to. Now, if we do this and save this, visually we'll get the same output as before. And if we inspect these links, we'll see that we still have anchor tags here. But these are now anchor tags rendered by this link component, and internally, React Router, this package we're using, will actually listen to clicks on those links, prevent the browser default, and instead manually update the URL for us so that it looks like if we switched the page, and it will then also change what we see on the screen. So we have this fake navigation, you could say, and that's what we want here. Because now with that, if I click here, we still switch the page, we still switch between products and welcome page, but if you watch this top left corner and this refresh icon, you see that it never spins, simply because now we don't send new requests. And we can see this in the DevTools as well. In the network tab, now we don't see any requests being sent because we don't send any. We stay on this loaded single page application, we don't lose any state, and we still give the user the illusion of switching between different pages. And therefore we now also got this shareable URL, which will then lead us to the right page when we enter it in the browser. And that is how we want to use routing. We want to define our routes as we did it before, but if we are on the page and we want to allow the user to navigate between these pages, then we want to use this link component instead of the standard anchor tag.